The Wyoming wind did not blow so much as it scoured, stripping the land down to its gray bones and hunting for any weakness in the living things that dared to cross it. It was late in the year 1888, and the high plains were holding their breath before the first killing freeze of winter. Eliza Moran walked because stopping meant remembering. And remembering was a jagged thing that cut deeper than the cold. She had been walking for 2 days, or perhaps 3. Time had lost its shape, dissolving into the rhythm of one boot dragging through the dust after the other. Her hem was heavy with burrs and dried mud, the fabric torn where it had caught on sagebrush, exposing the worn leather of boots that had never been meant for a journey like this. Her lips were cracked, tasting of iron and salt, and her throat was so dry it felt like she had swallowed a handful of the alkali dust that coated the wagon track. Every step sent a jolt of pain up her shins, but the physical hurt was a welcome distraction. It was a loud, demanding noise that drowned out the other sounds in her head. The roar of flames climbing a wall, the shattering of glass, and the hateful murmur of a town that had decided she was a monster long before the fire had ever started. She was alone in a vastness that felt indifferent to human suffering. To the west, the mountains were purple bruises against a sky that was rapidly darkening. To the east, the prairie rolled out like a wrinkled brown blanket, empty save for the scrub and the wind. Eliza was 24 years old, but she felt ancient, her spirit weathered down to a thin, brittle husk. A gust of wind hit her with the force of a physical blow, staggering her sideways. She stumbled off the hard-packed ruts of the wagon track and onto the loose shale of a slope leading down toward a dry creek bed. Her knees buckled. She went down hard, the sharp rocks biting into her palms, scraping the skin raw. For a long time, she did not move. She lay there with her cheek pressed against the cold stone, listening to the wind hiss through the dry grass. It would be so easy to stay here. The sun was sinking, bleeding crimson light across the horizon, and the temperature was dropping fast. If she just closed her eyes and let the darkness wrap around her, the cold would eventually stop hurting. It would become a warm, heavy blanket, and then there would be nothing. No more running, no more whispers, no more fear. The temptation was sweet and terrifying. As she lay there, fragmented flashes of the past week assaulted her, unbidden and cruel. She saw the farmhouse where she had lived for 5 years, a place that should have been a home but had been a prison. She smelled the cloying scent of whiskey on her husband's breath, a smell that always preceded the violence. She felt the phantom ache of old bruises on her ribs, the way her body instinctively curled in on itself to protect her softest parts. Then came the fire. It was always the fire that broke her. She saw the lantern shattering against the wall. She heard his scream, not of fear, but of rage. Even as the flames caught the dried timber, she remembered the heat, searing and bright, and the way she had crawled out into the yard, coughing up black smoke, watching the only roof she had burned against the night sky. And then the faces, the neighbors who had come not to comfort, but to judge, the sheriff with his cold eyes, the whispers that she had done it on purpose, that she was a witch, a whore, a fallen woman who had murdered a man to escape her duties. They had blamed her for the bruises he gave her. They had blamed her for his drinking. And now they blamed her for his death. Eliza pushed herself up, her arms trembling violently. She was not a murderer. She was just tired. So incredibly tired. She crawled forward, not back toward the road, but toward the edge of the slope. Ahead, the ground dropped away sharply into a deep, dry arroyo, a scar in the earth carved by ancient floods. It was a 20-foot drop to the jagged rocks below. She dragged herself to the ledge and looked down. The shadows were pooling at the bottom, thick and inviting. If she fell, it would be quick. It would be an accident, or at least that is what they would say. No one would miss Eliza Moran. Her family was gone. Her name was Mud, and her heart felt like a handful of ash. She sat on the edge, her legs dangling over the abyss, the wind whipping her torn skirts around her ankles. She stared into the dark, her breath hitching in her chest. She was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that part of her wanted to jump. She wanted the silence. Then, a sound cut through the wind. It was rhythmic, heavy, and distinct, the strike of iron on stone. Eliza stiffened. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Hoofbeats. Someone was coming. Panic, sharp and immediate, flooded her veins. In the last few years, every stranger had wanted something. Men looked at her with hungry, calculating eyes, seeing only a woman without protection. If she was found out here, alone and helpless, she would be prey. She looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the scrub brush was too low, and the terrain was too open. She was exposed on the ledge, a dark silhouette against the fading light. She tried to scramble back, to pull herself away from the edge and flatten herself against the earth, but her limbs were heavy as lead. The horse and rider crested the rise 50 yards away. They were nothing more than a dark shape at first, a shadow detaching itself from the twilight. The rider pulled the horse up short. The animal blew air through its nostrils, the sound carrying clearly in the thin atmosphere. Eliza froze. She pressed herself into the dirt, hoping the gloom would swallow her, but the rider had seen her. He turned the horse, a large bay stallion that looked as rough-coated as the landscape, and walked it slowly toward the arroyo. As he drew closer, the details emerged from the gray light. He was a cowboy, lean and hard-looking, wearing a canvas duster that had once been tan but was now stained with the dust of a dozen counties. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the way he sat in the saddle, loose but ready, like a coiled spring. He stopped the horse 10 feet away. He did not speak immediately. He just looked at her, and the weight of his gaze felt physical. He looked at the way she was huddled on the precipice, the way her hands clawed at the dirt, the desperate, hollow look in her eyes. He had seen that look before. It was the look of a creature that had been hunted until it had no run left in it. He swung down from the saddle. His boots hit the ground with a solid thud. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motion, his spurs jingling softly. Eliza flinched, scrambling backward until her heels kicked gravel over the edge of the cliff. The stones rattled as they fell, hitting the bottom with distant cracks. "Stay back," she croaked. Her voice was a ruin, a rasp of dry leaves. The man stopped. He raised his hands slightly, palms open. They were gloved in worn leather, his fingers long and sure. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was low, rough like gravel shifting under a stream, but there was no aggression in it. "Go away," Eliza whispered, tears finally spilling over, hot tracks cutting through the dust on her cheeks. "Just go away." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on hers. In the fading light, she saw his face. It was a hard map of a face, weathered by sun and wind. A thin, pale scar ran from his left cheekbone down to his jaw, disappearing into the stubble of a beard. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and unshocked. He did not look at her with pity, nor with lust. He looked at her with recognition. "You are too close to the edge, ma'am," he said calmly. "The ground is unstable there." "I do not care," she sobbed, her composure fracturing completely. "I do not care." She shifted, her balance precarious. The earth beneath her left hip crumbled. She gasped, sliding inches toward the drop. The man moved. He crossed the distance between them with terrifying speed, lunging forward not to attack, but to anchor. His hand clamped around her wrist. His grip was iron, inescapable and solid. Eliza cried out, terrified, and tried to wrench her arm away. "No, let me go!" He did not let go. He dropped to one knee, driving his boots into the soil for leverage, holding her fast as she thrashed weakly against him. He pulled her away from the lip of the canyon, dragging her a few feet onto solid ground. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking into a wail of pure despair. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and swimming with tears, pleading with a desperation that stripped her soul bare. "Please just let me go." The cowboy looked down at her. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. the fine lines of exhaustion around them. He saw the bruises on her neck, the terror in her posture, the absolute desire for cessation that radiated off her. "No," he said. It was a simple word, spoken without anger, but with the immovable weight of a mountain. "I cannot do that," he said. He pulled her up. Eliza tried to fight him, but she had no strength left. Her legs refused to hold her. She collapsed forward, her knees giving way, and she would have fallen if he had not caught her. She slammed against his chest, her hands balling into fists against his duster. She hit him weakly. Once, twice. "Why?" she sobbed into his coat. "Why won't you let me go?" He did not answer. He simply held her. He wrapped one arm around her shoulders to keep her from falling, his other hand gripping her upper arm to steady her. She could feel the solid warmth of him through the layers of their clothes. She could feel the steady, slow thump of his heart beneath her cheek. It was a rhythm of life in a place of death. Eliza sagged against him, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had come. She was humiliated. She was a grown woman, a widow, weeping in the arms of a stranger in the middle of nowhere. But beneath the shame, there was something else, a traitorous, instinctive relief. For the first time in years, she was not holding herself up. Someone else was holding the weight. "You are freezing," Jonah said quietly. He shifted his grip, supporting her more fully. "My horse is right here. I can walk," she whispered, though it was a lie. "No, you cannot," he corrected her gently. He bent slightly and swept her up into his arms. Eliza gasped, her hands instinctively clutching at his shoulders. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing more than a sack of grain. The movement was smooth, controlled. He carried her to the big bay horse. "Easy, girl," he murmured to the animal, who sidestepped nervously at the smell of fear coming off Eliza. Jonah lifted her high, settling her into the saddle. She gripped the pommel, her knuckles white, her head spinning. The ground seemed very far away, before she could protest or figure out what to do. Jonah put his boot in the stirrup and swung up behind her. He settled into the saddle, his body warm and solid against her back. He reached around her to take the reins, his arms forming a cage of safety on either side of her. "Lean back," he instructed, his voice rumbling in his chest, vibrating against her spine. "If you try to hold yourself straight, you will fall off." Eliza hesitated, rigid with propriety and fear, but a wave of dizziness forced her to obey. She leaned back, resting her weight against him. He did not pull away. He shifted slightly, accommodating her, one arm coming down to wrap firmly around her waist, locking her in place. "My name is Jonah," he said. "Jonah Cole." "Eliza," she whispered, the name slipping out before she could stop it. "All right, Eliza," he said. He clicked his tongue at the horse. "Let us get out of this wind." They rode in silence as the last of the light bled from the sky. The temperature plummeted with the sun. The wind turned cruel, biting through Eliza's thin, torn dress like knives of ice. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering. Jonah seemed to sense the cold seizing her. He shifted one hand from the reins and unbuttoned his duster, pulling the heavy canvas flaps wider so that they covered her legs and sides, trapping his body heat around her. It was an act of practical survival, yet the intimacy of it made Eliza's breath catch. She was surrounded by him, the smell of tobacco, old leather, horse sweat, and sage. They moved through a landscape that was vast and indifferent. The coyotes began to sing in the distance, their yips and howls echoing off the canyon walls. It was a lonely sound, the sound of the wild. But for the first time in a long time, the loneliness did not feel like it was inside her. It was out there, in the dark, and she was here, anchored by the man behind her. It took an hour to reach the hills. The terrain grew rougher, the horse picking its way carefully up rocky draws and through stands of twisted juniper. Finally, a small shape emerged from the darkness. It was a cabin, low-slung and built of rough-hewn logs, tucked into a fold of the land where it was sheltered from the worst of the gales. Jonah reined in the horse in front of the structure. "We are here," he said. He dismounted first, his boots crunching in the frost that was beginning to form on the grass. He reached up for her. Eliza tried to swing her leg over, but her muscles had locked up from the cold and the ride. She half fell into his waiting arms. He caught her easily, setting her on her feet, but he did not let go immediately. He waited until she found her balance, his hands hovering near her elbows. "Inside," he said, nodding toward the door. "I will see to the horse." Eliza stumbled toward the cabin. The door creaked on leather hinges as she pushed it open. The interior was pitch black. She stood in the doorway, shivering, hugging herself, until Jonah appeared behind her. He moved past her, striking a lucifer match against the doorframe. The flame flared, illuminating his scarred face for a second before he touched it to the wick of a kerosene lantern hanging from a rafter. Golden light flooded the room. It was a line cabin, used by cowboys pushing cattle in the summer or riding fence in the winter. It was sparse and clean. There was a narrow bunk built into one wall with a straw tick mattress, a small cast-iron stove in the corner, a rough table, and 2 chairs. Firewood was stacked neatly by the stove. "Sit," Jonah said, pointing to the chair nearest the cold stove. He moved efficiently, crumbling dry grass and kindling into the firebox. Within minutes, he had a fire roaring. The smell of burning pine pitch filled the small space, chasing away the stale, cold air. He set a battered blue enamel pot on the stove top. Eliza sat on the edge of the chair, her hands tucked between her knees to stop them from shaking. She watched him. He did not look at her. He seemed to be deliberately giving her space, moving around the perimeter of the room as if she were a skittish colt that might bolt if he moved too fast. He poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her. It was black and steaming. "Drink," he said. "It will help with the shock." She took the cup with trembling hands. The heat seeped into her frozen fingers, stinging but wonderful. She took a sip. It was bitter and strong, grounded with chicory, and it tasted like life. Jonah turned away and pulled a heavy wool blanket from the foot of the bunk. He shook it out and handed it to her. "Wrap up," he said. Eliza draped the blanket around her shoulders, pulling it tight. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice sounded strange in the small room, too loud, too human. Jonah nodded once. He took the other chair and dragged it to the far side of the room, near the door. He sat down, tipping his hat back slightly. He watched her drink the coffee. For the first time in the light, he really looked at her. He saw the way the blanket slipped from her shoulder, revealing the dark, mottled bruising on her upper arm, finger marks, old and yellowing. He saw the split in her lip and the haunted, hollow look in her eyes that spoke of hunger that went deeper than the belly. He felt a dark, cold anger coil in his gut. He knew violence. He had lived by it for 10 years of his life, riding with men who had no law but the gun. He knew what a fist did to a face, and he knew that the woman sitting in front of him had been beaten, systematically and recently, but he said nothing. He knew that to ask now would be to break her. "Rest," Jonah said, gesturing to the bunk. "You need sleep more than you need answers." Eliza looked at the bed, then at him. "Where will you sleep?" "I will sit here," Jonah said. He crossed his arms over his chest. "I have slept in worse places than a chair. The fire needs tending anyway." Eliza hesitated. The exhaustion was a physical weight, dragging her eyelids down. She moved to the bunk and sat down. The straw mattress rustled. She lay down, keeping her boots on, keeping the blanket wrapped tight around her like armor. She thought she would lie awake, terrified of the stranger in the room, but the warmth of the cabin and the sheer depletion of her reserves pulled her under. The sleep was not kind. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, the wind picked up outside, rattling the loose shingles on the roof. Eliza began to thrash on the narrow bed. Her breathing hitched, turning into sharp, panicked gasps. "No," she whimpered, her voice high and thin in the darkness. "I didn't. The lamp. Please, Thomas, don't." Jonah sat up in his chair. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull red glow across the floor. He watched the woman twist in the grip of her nightmare. "Fire," she whispered, a sound of pure horror. "It burns! It burns!" Jonah watched her, his face unreadable in the shadows. He did not wake her. He knew that sometimes waking a dreamer only brought the terror into the waking world. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. He listened to her pleas and her denials, piecing together the fragments of a story he had already half guessed. A man named Thomas, a lamp, a fire, and a guilt that was eating her alive. She was running from something that burned. Jonah Cole looked at his own hands, scarred and calloused. He knew about running. He knew about ghosts that followed you no matter how many miles you put between yourself and the past. He reached down and picked up a piece of firewood, placing it gently into the stove so as not to make a sound. The fire flared up, pushing back the dark. He would not ask her about it in the morning. Not yet. But as he settled back into his chair to keep watch over the broken woman who had asked him to let her die, Jonah made a silent promise to the empty room. He would not let the dark take her. Not tonight. Not while he still drew breath. The morning did not break so much as it bled into the cabin. A pale, diluted gray light that seeped through the cracks in the chinking in the single grime-streaked window. It was a cold light, indifferent and thin, carrying no promise of warmth. Eliza woke slowly, pulling herself up from the depths of an exhausted, dreamless sleep that felt more like a coma than rest. Her body ached with a deep, pervasive stiffness. Her hips felt bruised from the saddle, and her skin felt tight and dry, stretched over her bones like parchment. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The smell of pine pitch and stale coffee was unfamiliar, sharper than the damp, moldy scent of the room she had fled days ago. Panic flared in her chest, a habitual, sharp intake of breath, before memory washed over her. The desert, the cliff, the cowboy. She sat up, clutching the rough wool blanket to her chest. The cabin was quiet. Save for the wind testing the door hinges, she looked around the small space. Jonah Cole was asleep in the chair where she had last seen him. He was slumped awkwardly, his long legs stretched out toward the cold stove, boots crossed at the ankles. His chin rested on his chest, his hat tipped low over his eyes. He had given her the bed. He had surrendered the only comfort in this harsh shelter to a stranger he had found trying to end her life in the dirt. Eliza stared at him, feeling a flush of shame heat her cheeks. She was a burden. She had been a burden to her husband, a burden to her family, and now she was a burden to this man who had no reason to care if she lived or died. She moved to swing her legs out of the bunk, the straw mattress rustling loudly in the silence. Jonah moved instantly. His head snapped up, his hand going instinctively to the heavy revolver holstered at his hip before his eyes cleared. He blinked, the fog of sleep vanishing in a heartbeat, replaced by a sharp, assessing gaze. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough with sleep, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small room. "I took your bed," Eliza said. Her voice was small, but the hysteria of the night before had receded, leaving behind a brittle, fragile calm. "I am sorry. You should have woke me." Jonah rubbed a hand over his face, the sound of his palm against the stubble of his jaw loud in the quiet. "I can sleep anywhere," he said, standing up and stretching. His back cracked, a dry snap like a twig breaking. He picked up the coffee pot from the stove and shook it. "Empty. I will make more." He moved with that same economy of motion she had noticed the night before. He did not look at her as he rebuilt the fire, feeding kindling into the iron belly of the stove. Eliza watched him, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. She felt exposed, not just because her dress was torn and dirty, but because he had seen her at her absolute lowest. He had held her while she begged for death, when the fire was crackling. Jonah turned to face her. The morning light caught the scar on his cheek, turning it a silvery white. "I have work to do," he said plainly. "Fences to check along the south ridge, some strays to push back from the canyon." Eliza looked down at her hands. "I will go. I will just start walking." "Walking where?" Jonah asked. Eliza did not answer. There was nowhere to walk to. The desert lay in every direction, vast and hungry. Ash Hollow is a 2 hours ride from here, Jonah said. He crossed his arms, leaning back against the rough log wall. It is not much of a town, but there is a boarding house, a general store. People live there. He paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment. I am riding in that way to pick up supplies. He continued. I can take you. You can look for work, a roof, a meal that you earn. Eliza looked up at him. The choice hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. The darkness she had courted yesterday was still there, hovering at the edges of her mind. Death would be simpler. Death required nothing. It was a cessation of pain, a final closing of the account. To go to town, to try to live, meant opening herself up to the world again. It meant facing eyes that judged, tongues that wagged, and the constant grinding struggle to survive in a land that did not want her. But as she looked at Jonah, at the steady, unmoving patience in his stance, a flicker stirred in her chest. It was painful, like blood returning to a frozen limb. It was hope. Not a bright, burning hope, but a stubborn, ragged thing. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you help me? Jonah looked at her for a long moment. Because I was riding that ridge yesterday, he said, and I did not ride past. It was not an explanation, and yet it was everything. He offered no platitudes about God or duty. He simply acknowledged the fact of his presence and hers. All right, Eliza whispered. If you are going that way. Jonah nodded once. I am going that way. The ride to Ash Hollow was a journey through a broken world. The wind had died down, but the air remained bitter cold, smelling of dust and dried sage. Eliza sat behind Jonah again, her arms around his waist, though she tried to hold herself stiffly, creating a sliver of space between them. She failed. The gait of the horse and her own exhaustion kept throwing her against his back. The land they passed through was skeletal. The drought had held this part of Wyoming in a chokehold for 2 years, and the earth showed the bruises. The grass was brittle and yellow, snapping under the horse's hooves. Trees grew in twisted, agonized shapes along the dry creek beds, their branches stripping gray bark like peeling skin. Eliza looked at the horizon. The sky was immense, a pale, hard blue vault that stretched on forever. It made her feel small, insignificant, but strangely, it also felt like a witness, in the city or back on the farm. The horizon had always been blocked by buildings or fences. Here, there was nowhere to hide, but also no walls to hem her in. We are getting close, Jonah said over his shoulder. Another mile to the rise, then we will see the smoke. Eliza tensed, her stomach twisted into a cold knot. Towns meant people. People meant questions. They will know, she said, her voice snatched away by the breeze. Jonah turned his head slightly. Know what? That I am... She trailed off, unable to say the words. Ruined, cursed, wanted. That I do not belong. Jonah slowed the horse to a walk. Nobody knows you here. Eliza, this is a railroad town. Mostly, people come and go. Nobody asks too many questions about yesterday if you do the work today. They will ask who I am, she said. You can use a different name, Jonah said quietly, if you have reason to leave the old one behind. Eliza considered it. She could be Eliza Smith, Eliza Jones. She could invent a history, a widow from the East, a school teacher who lost her way. She could wash the ash of the fire from her skin and pretend to be clean. But as the thought formed, she felt a surge of weary defiance. She had done nothing wrong. She had survived. If she changed her name, it would be an admission of guilt. It would be hiding. And she was so tired of hiding. No, she said, her voice trembling but firm. My name is Eliza Moran. I will not lie about that. Jonah nodded, and she felt the movement against her cheek. Eliza Moran it is. And if anyone asks how you got here, you tell them I found you walking the road from the south and offered a ride. Simple as that. He did not mention the cliff. He did not mention her begging for death. He was giving her a story she could live with, a dignity she did not feel she possessed. They crested the rise, and Ash Hollow lay below them. It was a brown smear against the earth, a collection of timber buildings clustered around a single muddy street. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight, gray lines. A church steeple poked up like an accusing finger. Eliza gripped Jonah's coat tighter. "I am scared," she whispered. Jonah covered her hand with his own for a brief second. His glove was rough, but his touch was steady. "Keep your head up," he said. "Look them in the eye. If you look like prey, they will bite. If you look like you belong, they will mostly let you be." He urged the horse forward, and they descended into the town. Ash Hollow was busy for a weekday morning. A wagon loaded with lumber was bogged down in a rut near the livery, the driver cursing and whipping his mules. Men in canvas coats walked the boardwalks, their boots loud on the wood. A dog barked incessantly from an alleyway. As they rode down the main street, heads turned. Eliza felt the weight of the gazes like physical touches. They looked at Jonah, the scarred cowboy on the big bay horse. And then they looked at her, the disheveled woman clinging to his back with a torn dress and wild hair. Jonah did not look left or right. He rode straight to the hitching rail in front of a building with a sign that read, "Crawford's Mercantile Dry Goods." He dismounted and then reached up for her. This time, Eliza tried to slide down with some grace, but her legs were numb. Jonah caught her by the waist, swinging her down to the boardwalk. He stood between her and the street, blocking the view of two ranch hands who had stopped rolling cigarettes to stare. "Inside," Jonah said, ushering her through the door. A bell chimed overhead. The interior of the store smelled of spices, leather, and sawdust. It was warm, a pot-belly stove glowing in the center of the room. Behind the long wooden counter stood a woman with gray hair pulled back into a severe bun. She wore a high-collared dress and an apron that looked stiff enough to stand on its own. This was Mrs. Crawford. Her eyes, sharp and dark like a bird's, snapped to Jonah, then slid to Eliza. The assessment was instantaneous and brutal. She took in the torn hem, the dust-streaked face, the lack of a wedding ring, and the fact that she had arrived with a man who was not her husband. "Jonah Cole." "Mrs." Crawford said, her tone cool. "You are in town early." "Mrs. Crawford," Jonah said. He took his hat off, holding it against his chest. He did not step away from Eliza. He stood just slightly in front of her, his shoulder overlapping hers. "I need 50 pounds of flour, coffee, and a box of shells." "Mrs." Crawford began to write on a slate, but her eyes never left Eliza. "And who is this?" The silence in the store was sudden. The two ranch hands had followed them in and were pretending to look at a display of bridles. Their ears pricked. Eliza opened her mouth, but her throat seized. "This is Mrs. Eliza Moran," Jonah said. His voice was calm, conversational, but there was a steel thread running through it that Eliza had heard on the cliff edge. "I found her stranded on the south road. She had some trouble with a wagon." It was a lie, but a small one, a protective one. "Is that so?" Mrs. Crawford said, her eyebrows lifting. "Trouble? She is a seamstress," Jonah continued, ignoring the skepticism. "She is looking for honest work. I told her this was a town that valued good needlework." He turned to Eliza, his expression open and respectful. "Mrs. Crawford runs the finest establishment in the county. If anyone knows who needs help, it is her." It was a masterful stroke. He had flattered the shopkeeper while simultaneously framing Eliza as a skilled worker rather than a beggar. But more importantly, he had used a tone that carried a subtle warning to the men in the room. By treating Eliza with such deliberate, formal respect, he was signaling that any disrespect from others would be a personal insult to him. "Mrs." Crawford looked at Jonah. She saw the way he stood, protective but not possessive. She saw that his hand was not gripping Eliza's arm, but resting on the counter near hers, creating a barrier. She softened, just a fraction. "A seamstress, Mrs.?" Crawford asked, looking at Eliza's hands. Eliza stepped forward, fighting the urge to hide her raw, scraped palms. "Yes, ma'am, I can mend, alter, and sew from patterns. I am quick, and I do not waste thread." "Mrs." Crawford sniffed. Well, Lord knows the bachelor miners around here walk around with more holes than cloth in their trousers. But they do not pay well. She paused, tapping her pencil against her chin. Lorna Keats, over at the boarding house, was complaining just yesterday that her linens are falling apart and she has no time to fix them. And the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Halpern, is looking for someone to turn the collars on the Reverend's shirts. Eliza felt a rush of relief so intense it made her dizzy. Thank you. I will go there immediately. It is the blue house at the end of the street, Mrs. Crawford said. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small, wrapped stick of peppermint candy. She hesitated, then slid it across the wood toward Eliza. You look like you could use some sugar, Mrs. Moran. You are pale as a sheet. Thank you, Eliza whispered. Taking the candy, her hand shook. I will settle up for my goods later, Jonas said, putting his hat back on. I am going to walk Mrs. Moran to the boarding house. They walked back out into the cold wind. The ranch hands watched them go, but they said nothing. Jonah walked on the street side of the boardwalk, placing himself between Eliza and the mud and the horses. The boarding house was a large, rambling structure that had once been painted a cheerful blue, but was now scoured to a dull gray blue by the wind. A sign swung above the porch. Keats boarding. Meals. No spirits. Jonah stopped at the steps. I will leave you here to talk to Mrs. Keats. It is better if you make the deal yourself. Eliza nodded. She understood. If he negotiated for her, she would look like his property. If she did it herself, she was a woman of business. Thank you, Jonah, she said. He touched the brim of his hat. I will check on you before I ride out. Eliza watched him walk away, leading his horse toward the livery stable. She took a deep breath, smoothed her torn skirts as best she could, and walked up the steps. Mrs. Lorna Keats answered the door on the second knock. She was a thin woman with wire-rimmed spectacles and hair the color of iron filings. She looked Eliza up and down, her eyes lingering on the dust and the boots. Mrs. Crawford sent me, Eliza said quickly. Before the door could close, she said you needed mending done. I am a seamstress, Mrs. Keats narrowed her eyes. I cannot pay wages, not cash money. I need a room, Eliza said. And food. I will mend every sheet, towel, and shirt in this house. I will help with the washing if need be. Just a place to sleep. Mrs. Keats pursed her lips. She looked past Eliza to the street, then back at her face. She saw the desperation, but she also saw the set of Eliza's jaw. I have a room under the eaves. Mrs. Keats said. It is small. Gets hot in summer and cold in winter. You eat what the boarders leave, or you eat with me in the kitchen after. No men in the room. No drinking. If I catch you stealing, I will call the marshal. I accept, Eliza said. Come in, then, Mrs. Keats said, stepping back. Wipe your boots. The room was exactly as described. It was a tiny triangle of space under the roof, barely big enough for the narrow iron bed and a washstand. The ceiling sloped so sharply that Eliza could only stand upright in the center of the floor, but it had a door with a lock. Eliza sat on the bed. The mattress was thin, but the quilt was clean. She looked out the small, round window at the town below. She heard the clang of a blacksmith's hammer and the distant tolling of a church bell. She was alive. She had a name. She had a room. But as the adrenaline faded, the fear crept back in. She was a stranger in a town that felt tight and insular. How long would it take for them to see the darkness she carried? How long before Mrs. Crawford's polite suspicion turned to open hostility? She pressed her hand against the glass. She felt like an imposter, a wolf in sheep's clothing waiting to be discovered. The sun began to set, casting long, melancholy shadows across Ash Hollow. Eliza had spent the afternoon mending a stack of tablecloths in the kitchen, keeping her head down, speaking only when spoken to. Now, she stood on the porch, wrapping her thin shawl tight around her shoulders. She saw him coming up the street. Jonah. He had washed the dust from his face and beaten the worst of it from his coat. He walked with a slow, rolling gait that spoke of years in the saddle. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "You got the room?" "Yes," Eliza said. "Mrs. Keats is firm, but fair. I think good," Jonah said. He came up 2 steps, leaning against the porch rail. He was close enough that she could smell the soap he had used, a clean lye scent that cut through the dust. They stood in silence for a moment as the street grew dim. Lamps were being lit in windows, turning the town into a patchwork of amber squares. "I have to head back," Jonah said. "Stock to tend." "You have done so much," Eliza said, her fingers twisting the fringe of her shawl. "I do not know how to repay you." "No debt," Jonah said quietly. "Just stay away from the edge." He meant the cliff, but they both knew he meant more. A sudden gust of wind swept down the street, kicking up a devil of dust and leaves. It hit the porch with a moan, cutting right through Eliza's threadbare clothes. She gasped, her body seizing in a violent shiver. Without a word, Jonah shrugged out of his canvas duster. He stepped forward and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was heavy, warm from his body, and smelled of him. It engulfed her, the sleeves hanging past her hands. The weight of it was grounding. Eliza looked up at him. Startled, their faces were inches apart. She saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the roughness of his skin. For a moment, neither of them moved. The gesture was practical. She was cold. He had a coat, but it felt shockingly intimate. In a world where touch was usually a precursor to violence, this heavy, warm weight felt like a shield. "Keep it," Jonah said. "I have a heavy vest. You will freeze in that dress." Eliza pulled the lapels together. "Thank you," she whispered. Across the street, in the shadow of the church doorway, a figure watched them. Reverend Halpern stood perfectly still, his black frock coat blending into the gloom. He was a tall man, gaunt and severe, with eyes that saw sin in every shadow. He watched the cowboy, Jonah Cole, a man whose hands were stained with blood from the range wars, drape his coat over the strange woman. The Reverend narrowed his eyes. He had heard the rumors already. A woman found on the road, a woman with no husband and bruised skin, and now she was standing on the porch with a hired gun, looking at him as if he were a savior. Halpern did not believe in saviors who wore guns, and he did not trust women who wandered out of the desert. He filed the image away. The intimacy, the coat, the look in their eyes, like a piece of evidence to be used at a later trial. On the porch, Jonah stepped back. The distance between them opened up again, cold and empty. "I will be back in town next week," he said. "I will check on you." "I will be here," Eliza said. Jonah turned and walked down the steps, fading into the twilight toward the livery. Eliza stood there, wrapped in his coat, watching him go. She felt a complicated ache in the center of her chest. It was fear of needing him, fear of the debt she was accruing. But beneath the fear was a pull, magnetic and terrifying. She remembered the way he had looked at her in the cabin, and the way he had looked at her just now. Not like she was trash, not like she was a fallen woman. He looked at her like she was someone worth saving. And that, Eliza realized as she shivered in the dark, was the most dangerous thing of all, because if she started to believe him, she would have something to lose again. November hardened into December, and the high plains of Wyoming turned into an anvil of ice and gray sky. The wind did not stop. It simply changed its voice, shifting from a hollow moan to a high, thin shriek that found every gap in the siding of the boarding house. Eliza Moran had become a fixture in the back room of Mrs. Keats's establishment, a ghost with a needle. She worked with a ferocity that bordered on desperation. Her hands, once raw from her flight across the desert, were now rough from the prick of the needle and the friction of wool and canvas. She turned collars on the Reverend's shirts until they looked new. She mended the torn hems of ranch wives who came into town only once a month, their faces windburned and weary. She took in trousers from the miners that smelled of blasting powder and sweat, and she returned them clean and whole. She was useful. In a hard town, usefulness was a currency more valuable than gold. It bought her a tentative tolerance. The women of Ash Hollow would nod to her in the street, their eyes sliding away quickly, unwilling to hold her gaze for too long. They spoke to her about inseams and thread counts, about the price of calico and the durability of denim. They did not speak to her about her past, nor did they ask about the nights she spent alone in the tiny attic room. But the silence was not peace. It was a dam holding back a reservoir of speculation. Eliza felt the whispers trailing her like static electricity. She heard them in the sudden hush when she entered the general store, in the way Mrs. Halpern, the preacher's wife, pursed her lips when Eliza handed over the mended linens. They knew she had arrived on the back of Jonah Cole's horse. They knew she had no ring. They knew she had come from the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperation that smelled of sin. To them, she was a question mark drawn in charcoal, smudged and suspicious. Yet, the work grounded her. There was a simple, brutal logic to sewing that her own life lacked. A tear could be mended. A seam could be reinforced. If you followed the pattern, the pieces fit together. It was the only thing in her world that made sense. The winter deepened. Snow fell in fitful, angry bursts, freezing into hard drifts that turned the streets into a treacherous maze of icy ruts. The days grew short, the sun giving up the ghost by 4 in the afternoon, plunging the town into a long, frigid twilight. Jonah Cole became the punctuation mark in her long, quiet sentences. He did not come every day. He had cattle to feed and miles of fence line that snapped under the weight of the frost, but he came often enough that Mrs. Keats stopped raising an eyebrow when his boots sounded on the porch steps. He never stayed long, and he never presumed. He would stand on the porch, leaning against the rail, wrapped in his heavy sheepskin coat, his hat pulled low against the biting wind. He would ask if she was warm enough. He would ask if the work was steady. Sometimes he brought things. It started with small, practical tokens, a spool of blue silk thread from the mercantile, the color of a summer sky. It fell off the wagon, he had claimed, though the wrapping was pristine. Then it was a small sack of peppermint drops. Mrs. Crawford insisted. One afternoon, when the sky was the color of a bruised plum, he pulled a wrapped bundle from his saddlebag. He handed it to her without looking at her face. "Found this near the creek bed," he mumbled. "Thought it might smell better than the lye soap Mrs. Keats uses." It was a handful of dried wild sage, tied with a strip of leather. The scent was sharp, clean, and wild. It smelled of the open land, of the wind before it hit the town's chimneys. Eliza held it to her nose, inhaling deeply, and for a moment, the cramped, stale air of the boarding house vanished. "Thank you, Jonah," she said, her voice catching. He shrugged, shifting his weight. "Just sage. Grows like a weed." But it was not just sage. It was an acknowledgement that she was a person who might like something beautiful, not just something useful. Another time, he brought an apple. It was small and withered, kept in a root cellar somewhere on a distant ranch. But it was red. In the monochrome world of winter, it looked like a jewel. "Not much of a crop this year," Jonah said, watching her turn the fruit in her hands. "But it is sweet." He was feeding her, bit by bit, not just with food, but with dignity. The turning point came on a Tuesday in late January. The temperature had plummeted to 20 degrees below freezing. The wind was a physical assault, rattling the windows in their frames until the glass hummed. Jonah arrived just after dusk. He looked frozen through. Ice clung to his mustache, and his knuckles were white where they gripped the brim of his hat. He stood on the porch, shivering uncontrollably, though he tried to hide it by stamping his feet. Eliza opened the door, the heat from the hallway spilling out. She saw the way his shoulders were hunched, the gray cast to his skin. "Come inside," she said. It was not a request. Jonah hesitated. "Mrs. Keats." "Mrs. Keats is in the kitchen making stew," Eliza said. "It is too cold for a dog out here, let alone a man. Come inside." She stepped back, leaving the door open. Jonah looked at her, then at the warmth beyond. He stepped over the threshold, bringing the smell of cold air and horses with him. The common room was empty. A small cast-iron stove sat in the corner, glowing cherry red at the bottom. A round table with a kerosene lamp sat near it. "Sit," Eliza commanded gently. She pointed to the chair nearest the stove. She went to the kitchen and returned a moment later with a pot of coffee and 2 cups. "Mrs." Keats had glanced at her but said nothing, perhaps because even her rigid propriety bowed before the severity of the weather. They sat at opposite sides of the small table. The lamp cast a golden circle of light, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. Eliza picked up a shirt she was hemming, one of Jonah's, though neither of them mentioned it, and began to stitch. Jonah wrapped his large, scarred hands around the tin cup, letting the steam rise into his face. For a long time, the only sounds were the hiss of the fire, the tick of the cooling metal, and the soft snick-snick of Eliza's needle. It was a domestic quiet. It felt dangerous in its normalcy. "I rode with a bad crew," Jonah said suddenly. Eliza did not look up, but her needle paused mid-stitch. He had never spoken of his past, not really, just vague allusions to drift and work. "When I was young," Jonah continued, his voice low and rough, as if the words were dragging over stones. "Down in the territories, New Mexico." "Arizona. We worked for the cattle barons. They paid us $40 a month and found—" He took a sip of coffee, his eyes fixed on the black liquid. "They paid us to ensure the water rights stayed where they wanted them. Sometimes that meant cutting fences. Sometimes it meant burning shacks." He paused, his jaw working. "Sometimes it meant shooting men who wouldn't leave." Eliza looked at him then. The lamplight deepened the shadows in the hollows of his cheeks. He looked tired. He looked like a man carrying a sack of rocks he could never set down. "I did things," he said, meeting her gaze. "Things a man cannot wash off. Things that stay in the blood." He was giving her an out. He was showing her his monsters so she could run if she wanted to. He was telling her that the protector she relied on had been a predator once. Eliza set the shirt down in her lap. She felt a strange, sympathetic ache in her chest. It was not fear. She knew fear intimately, and this was not it. This was recognition. "I was married for 5 years, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling like a taut wire. Jonah went still. "His name was Thomas," she said. Saying the name out loud felt like summoning a demon, but she pushed through. "He was charming, at first. Everyone said I was lucky, a good farm, a strong husband." She traced the grain of the wood on the table with her finger. "He drank, and when the whiskey was in him, he saw things that weren't there. He saw insults. He saw betrayal." She looked at her hands. "He broke my arm once, told the doctor I fell from the loft. He broke my ribs the next winter. I told the neighbors a horse kicked me." Jonah's hands tightened on the cup until the metal groaned. "The fire," Eliza whispered. It was late. He was drunker than usual. He came at me with the lantern. He said I was looking at him with hate. I pushed him away. I just pushed him. He stumbled. The lantern hit the wall. She closed her eyes. The oil spread so fast. He was heavy. He passed out from the smoke or the drink. I do not know. I tried to drag him. I swear. Jonah, I tried. But the heat, it was eating the room. She opened her eyes. They were wet, shining in the lamplight. I crawled out. He didn't. And when the town came, when his brother came, they looked at the bruises on me, and they didn't see a victim. They saw a woman who finally fought back. They said I let him burn. They said I locked the door." She looked at him, waiting for the judgment, waiting for him to see the monster the others saw. Jonah's jaw was clamped so tight a muscle feathered in his cheek. He was not looking at her with disgust. He was looking at her with a fury so intense it terrified her. But she realized with a jolt that the fury was not directed at her. It was a shield, raised to stand between her and the memory. "Surviving is not a sin," Jonah said. His voice was hard, absolute. "You did not light that fire, Eliza." "And even if you had," A man who raises his hand to a woman forfeits his right to mercy. Eliza let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 3 years. I feel cursed, she confessed. Like I carry the smoke with me. You are not cursed, Jonah said. He leaned forward, entering the circle of light more fully. You are hurt. There is a difference. The way he looked at her, steady, unblinking, seeing the wreckage and not turning away, made her chest burn. It was a mixture of profound relief and a sharp, stinging shame. She did not feel worthy of this absolution. Outside, the wind dropped, replaced by the heavy, muffled silence of snowfall. The world went quiet, as if wrapping the cabin in cotton wool. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked, then silence. Mrs. Keats had gone to bed. They were alone. The intimacy of the moment shifted. The shared secrets hung in the air, stripping away the social distance they had carefully maintained. They were just a man and a woman in a warm room, bound by the scars they had just revealed to one another. The fire is dying, Eliza said, needing to do something, anything, to break the intensity of his gaze. She stood up, her legs stiff from sitting. She reached for the wood box near the stove. As she bent, a wave of dizziness hit her, perhaps from the heat, perhaps from the emotional release. She stumbled, her boot catching on the uneven floorboards. Eliza! Jonah was there before she could fall. He moved with that startling predator speed. His hands caught her by the waist, steadying her. For a breathless second, time stopped. She was pressed against him, her hands instinctively coming up to rest on his forearms to catch her balance, beneath the flannel of his shirt. She could feel the hard cords of muscle, rigid with tension. The heat from the stove radiated against her side, but the heat from his body was more immediate, more overwhelming. She looked up. His face was inches from hers. She could see the pores of his skin, the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, the way his breath hitched in his chest. The air between them thrums, thick and heavy. Eliza felt a sudden, fierce hunger surge through her. It was a physical ache, a desperate need to be held, to be touched, to be known. It was the starving part of her soul crying out for sustenance. She saw the same hunger reflected in Jonah's eyes, a raw, naked want that he was fighting to control. His hands on her waist were heavy and warm. His thumbs pressed slightly into the fabric of her dress, as if he wanted to pull her closer. If he did, she knew she would not resist. She would collapse into him. She wanted to burn in a different kind of fire. Jonah! She breathed. The sound of his name seemed to snap a tether. Jonah's eyes darkened, dropping to her mouth for a fraction of a second, and the longing on his face was so intense it looked like pain. Then he froze. He took a breath, ragged and deep, slowly, agonizingly. His fingers relaxed. He did not shove her away, but he withdrew his hands with a deliberate slowness, stepping back until there was a foot of empty air between them. I will not do that, he said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of all its usual calm. Eliza stood there, swaying slightly, her skin tingling where he had touched her. She felt rejected, and her face flamed. I will not be another man who takes from you, Jonah said roughly. He looked at her, his expression fierce and tortured. You are vulnerable, Eliza. You are alone and you are scared. If I touch you now, if I let this happen, it is because you need safety, not because you want me. That is not true, Eliza whispered, the truth slipping out. It might be, Jonah countered, and I will not risk it. You have been used enough. I will not add my name to that list. He grabbed his hat from the table, his movements jerky and uncoordinated for the first time. I have to go. Jonah, wait, Eliza called out. But he was already moving to the door. He opened it, and a swirl of snow blew in, breaking the spell of the warm room. He looked back at her one last time. Lock the door, Eliza, he said. Then he was gone, vanishing into the white swirl of the night. Eliza stood in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt hollowed out, empty where his presence had been, but beneath the frustration and the confusion, something else was taking root. He could have taken her. She would have let him, but he hadn't. He had placed her dignity above his own desire. He had refused to exploit her weakness. She touched her waist where his hands had been. For the first time in her life, a man had touched her and then stopped because he respected her too much to continue. It shook her to her core. The days that followed were strange. The snow kept falling, burying Ash Hollow in a suffocating blanket of white. But the atmosphere in the town felt brittle, as if the cold had made everyone's temper snap. Eliza worked, but her mind was constantly on the moment by the stove. The memory of Jonah's restraint was a warm coal she carried in her pocket. But the world outside did not pause for their fragile, unspoken courtship. 3 days after the storm broke, 2 strangers rode into town. They arrived on tired horses, shaking the snow from their dusters as they tied up in front of the saloon. They were not passing through. Men who pass through do not stop to study the faces of the locals with such predatory intent. One was a man with a tin star pinned to a heavy wool coat, Marshall Lawson. He was a thick-set man with a face like a bulldog, jowls heavy, eyes wet and small. He carried a sheaf of papers in his saddlebag, the edges worn from handling. The other man was thinner, wirier. He wore clothes that had once been fine but were now greasy and worn. His face was narrow, dominated by a nose that had been broken and set crookedly. His eyes were pale, watery blue, and mean. They went to the saloon first, then the general store. Rumors travel faster than telegrams in a small town. Within an hour, Mrs. Keats came into the kitchen, her face pale. "There are men asking questions," she said, scrubbing a pot with unnecessary vigor. Eliza looked up from her sewing. "What men?" "A marshal," Mrs. Keats said, not looking at her. "And another one. They are asking about a fire. They are asking about a woman who ran off." The needle slipped, burying itself deep in Eliza's thumb. She didn't feel the pain. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and dizzy. "What did they say?" Eliza whispered. "They said she is a murderess," Mrs. Keats said flatly. She turned to look at Eliza, her eyes searching. "They said she burned her husband alive for the insurance money." "That is a lie," Eliza said, standing up. The chair scraped loudly on the floor. "It is a lie." "Is it?" Mrs. Keats asked. "Because you have never told me why you are here, Eliza, and trouble has a way of finding people who don't talk." Eliza didn't answer. She ran to the window. She looked down onto the main street. The snow was churned into brown slush. There, standing in front of the livery stable, was the thin man. He was lighting a cigarette, cupping his hands against the wind. The gesture was familiar, horribly, sickeningly familiar. It was Ephraim Kane, Thomas's brother. He looked exactly as she remembered him, bitter, greedy, and cruel. He was laughing at something the blacksmith said, a sharp, barking sound that she could almost hear through the glass. Terror, cold and absolute, washed over her. He had found her. After all the miles, after the desert, after the silence, he had found her. And he had brought the law with him. She backed away from the window, her hands trembling so hard she had to clasp them together to stop them. Across the street, Jonah was walking out of the general store with a sack of grain over his shoulder. He stopped. He looked up at the boarding house window. As he often did, he saw her. He saw the pale oval of her face pressed against the glass. He saw the way her eyes were wide, staring at something down the street with the look of a trapped animal. Jonah dropped the grain sack. It hit the boardwalk with a heavy thud. He followed her gaze. He saw the marshal. He saw the man with the watery eyes and the mean laugh. Jonah Cole stood very still in the snow. He felt the old instinct rising in his blood, the cold, metallic taste of adrenaline. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that the quiet days were over. The past had arrived, and it had brought a noose. He looked back up at the window, meeting Eliza's terrified gaze across the distance. He gave a single, imperceptible nod. "I am here." Then he stepped off the boardwalk and into the mud, his hand brushing the grip of his revolver as he walked toward the strangers. The confrontation happened just after the noon meal, when the winter sun was a pale, heatless disk hanging high above the main street of Ash Hollow. The wind had lulled for a deceptive hour, drawing people out of their homes to check mail or buy supplies, creating a bustle of life that felt fragile against the backdrop of the gray, looming sky. Eliza stepped out onto the porch of the boarding house, a basket of mended linens in her arms. She intended to deliver them to the mercantile before the weather turned again. She felt almost steady. The work of the morning had been good, her stitches straight and true, and the memory of the quiet evening with Jonah still acted as a buffer against her fear. Then a shadow fell across the steps. "There she is," a voice rasped. It was a sound like a saw cutting through wet wood. "The grieving widow!" Eliza froze. The basket trembled in her hands. She looked down to the street and saw Ephraim Kane standing in the mud, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt. He was wearing a long, greasy coat that flapped around his legs, and his face, narrow, rat-like, and twisted with a performative grief, was turned up toward her. Beside him stood Marshall Lawson, looking uncomfortable but resolute, and behind them, a knot of townsfolk had already begun to gather, drawn by the volume of Ephraim's voice. "Ephraim," Eliza whispered. The name tasted of ash. "Do not speak my name," Ephraim shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her. "Do not let my family name cross your lying tongue, woman!" He turned to the crowd, his voice pitching up to ensure he was heard by the men loading wagons at the livery and the women peering out of the general store. "Look at her," Ephraim bellowed. "She stands there looking modest, looking meek. But I tell you, there is blood on those hands. My brother Thomas, her husband, her provider, died screaming in a fire she set." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Faces that had been politely indifferent to Eliza for weeks now sharpened with a sudden, hungry fascination. Scandal was a rare and potent entertainment in a place as hard as Ash Hollow. Eliza dropped the basket. The linens tumbled onto the dirty porch floor. She gripped the railing, her knuckles white. "That is a lie," she cried out, though her voice sounded thin in the cold air. "It was an accident. You know it was an accident." "Accident?" Ephraim laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He stepped closer to the porch, invading her space from below. "Was it an accident that the policy on the house was paid up the week before? Was it an accident that you walked out without a burn on you while Thomas was roasted alive in his own bed?" "He was drunk!" Eliza shouted back, desperation lending her a frantic strength. She looked at the crowd, pleading with her eyes. "He was drunk and he knocked over the lamp. He came at me. We struggled. I tried to pull him out. I tried, but he was too heavy, and the smoke—" "She left him," Ephraim roared, drowning her out. "She locked the door and listened to him burn so she could run off with the insurance money and play the whore in the next county." "No!" Eliza screamed, tears hot and instant in her eyes. "I never saw a penny. I ran because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Reverend Halpern's voice cut through the clamor like a gavel strike. The crowd parted as the tall, black-clad figure of the preacher ascended the steps of the church across the street and walked toward the boarding house. He moved with the slow, terrifying certainty of a man who believes he speaks for God. "Reverend," Eliza gasped, "please, you know I have lived quietly here." Halpern stopped at the foot of the stairs, looking up at her with eyes that were cold and void of mercy. "I know that sin often wears a quiet mask, Mrs. Moran," Halpern said. His voice was not loud, but it carried perfectly. "I know that a woman who flees her home and arrives in the company of a man of violence brings questions with her. And perhaps the Lord is finally bringing those hidden things to light." He turned to the crowd. "Does Scripture not say that the wicked flee when no man pursueth? Why run, Eliza, if there was no guilt?" His public doubt was the final permission the town needed. Eliza saw the shift in their faces. "Mrs." Crawford turned away, clutching her shawl. The ranch hands near the livery spat into the dirt, their expressions hardening into contempt. They did not see a seamstress anymore. They saw a monster who had burned a man for gold. "Marshal," Ephraim said, stepping back with a smug, satisfied set to his jaw. "Do your duty." Marshal Lawson sighed and stepped heavily onto the first step of the porch. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded, stiff piece of paper. "Eliza Moran," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "I have a warrant here for your arrest, issued in Carbon County. The charges are arson, insurance fraud, and the murder of Thomas Kane." Eliza felt the world tilt. The gray sky seemed to spin, and the ground beneath her feet felt insubstantial. "No," she whispered. "I did not." Lawson came up the stairs. He pulled a pair of heavy iron shackles from his belt. The metal clinked, a sound of finality. "Hands," he ordered. Eliza stood paralyzed. Lawson reached out, grabbed her wrist roughly, and snapped the cold iron around her skin. The click echoed in the silence. She stared at the chains connecting her hands, the weight of them dragging her shoulders down. She was bound. She was a criminal. "Take her!" Ephraim shouted from the street. "Hang her high! Back off!" The roar came from the street, sudden and furious. The crowd split apart as Jonah Cole shoved his way through. He had come from the livery, having heard the shouting, and he looked like a storm front moving in. His face was pale with rage, his eyes dark and dangerous. He vaulted up the steps, placing himself between Eliza and the marshal. He did not draw the gun at his hip, but his hand hovered inches from it, his entire posture radiating a lethal intent. "You step back, Lawson," Jonah warned, his voice a low growl. "She is under arrest." "Jonah," Lawson said, his hand dropping to his own weapon. "Do not do something stupid. This is a lawful warrant." "It is a warrant based on the lies of a man who wants his brother's land money," Jonah spat, jerking his head toward Ephraim. "Look at him. Does he look like a grieving brother, or a man settling a score?" "That is for a judge to decide," Lawson said, though his eyes flicked nervously to Jonah's gun hand. "Then she sees a judge." Jonah said, "She does not go with you and him." He pointed at Ephraim. "Out on the road alone. Not today. Not with the weather turning. I am taking her to the county seat," Lawson insisted. "You are not," Jonah said. He stepped closer, towering over the stocky lawman. "You take her out of this town with that man riding alongside, and I will consider it a kidnapping. And you know my history. Marshal, you know I will not hesitate to stop a kidnapping." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Jonah's reputation as a former hired gun was a tangible thing, a ghost that stood beside him. Lawson looked at Jonah's eyes and saw no bluff there. He saw a man ready to die, or kill, right there on the boarding house porch. Lawson licked his lips. He looked at the sky, which was darkening rapidly. "The storm is coming in fast anyway," he muttered, finding a face-saving excuse. "Roads will be impassable in an hour." He lowered his hand from his gun. "Fine. She stays in the town jail until the weather breaks. Then we ride for the judge, but she stays in a cell. Jonah, no exceptions. A cell is safer than the road with him," Jonah said, casting a look of pure venom at Ephraim. He turned to Eliza. She was shaking so hard the chains rattled against her wrists. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide and unseeing. "I am here," Jonah said softly, his voice dropping the aggression instantly as he looked at her. "I'm not leaving." Lawson took Eliza's arm. "Come on, let's get this done." They led her down the steps, past the jeering Ephraim, past the silent, judging face of Reverend Halpern, and through the mud to the small stone building at the end of the street that served as the jail. Jonah walked 3 paces behind, his hand never leaving the vicinity of his holster, guarding her from the hatred of the town she had tried so hard to serve. Night fell early and hard. The temperature plummeted, and the wind began to howl in earnest, driving snow against the stone walls of the jailhouse. The cell was a small, square room at the back of the marshal's office. It had 3 stone walls and a front made of thick iron bars. There was a narrow wooden bench with a thin blanket, a bucket, and nothing else. It was cold, a damp, permeating chill that settled in the bones. Eliza sat on the bench, her knees drawn up to her chest, Her arms wrapped tightly around her shins. The shackles had been removed when she was locked in, but her wrists still felt heavy, phantom metal biting into her skin. She stared at the darkness. The shadows seemed to take the shape of her memories. Thomas's angry face, the flames climbing the wallpaper, the look of disgust on Mrs. Crawford's face. Maybe they are right, a voice whispered in her head. Maybe I did kill him. I hated him enough to want him dead. Is that not the same thing? The outer door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and a blast of freezing air. Marshal Lawson's voice grumbled something, and then heavy boots walked across the floorboards. Jonah appeared in the corridor. He held a kerosene lantern in one hand, the light swinging and casting long, dancing shadows against the bars. Lawson gave me 5 minutes, Jonah said quietly. He hung the lantern on a hook on the wall and pulled a wooden stool over to the cell door. He sat down, close enough that his breath misted in the air between them. Eliza did not look up. "You should not be here," she whispered. Her voice was hollow, scraped clean of hope. "It will only make it worse for you." "I do not care about worse," Jonah said. "They think I am a monster," Eliza said. She rocked slightly back and forth. "Maybe I am. I brought ruin to my husband. I brought ruin to my family. Now I have brought this storm to you." "Stop it," Jonah said. "It is true," she insisted, finally looking at him. Her eyes were dark pits of despair. "I am cursed. Jonah, everywhere I go, things burn. You should have let me jump. You should have let me go in the desert." Jonah stood up. He moved to the bars and dropped to his knees on the cold stone floor, bringing his face level with hers. "Give me your hands," he said. Eliza hesitated, then slowly uncurled her arms. She reached through the bars. Jonah took her hands in his. His grip was firm, warm, and calloused. He rubbed his thumbs over her raw knuckles, over the skin that had been chafed by the irons. "Look at me," he commanded gentle. Eliza met his gaze, the lantern light reflected in his eyes, turning them into pools of warm amber. "I have seen monsters," Jonah said. "I have ridden with them. I have seen men who kill for sport and men who kill for greed. I know what malice looks like. Eliza, it has a smell. It has a shape." He squeezed her hands tighter. "You do not have it." "I look at you and I see a woman who has been beaten by the world but refused to break. I see someone who tried to save a man who hurt her. That is not a curse. That is grace." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. The armor she had built around her heart, the belief that she was wicked, that she deserved this punishment, shattered. A sob broke from her throat, a harsh, tearing sound. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the cold iron bars, and wept. She pulled Jonah's hands toward her, pressing his rough palms against her wet cheeks, clinging to his warmth as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the earth. "I am so afraid," she wept into his hands. "I am so afraid they will hang me. They will not," Jonah vowed. "I will not let them." The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. In that bleak, freezing cell, separated by iron, they were closer than they had ever been. Eliza felt the pulse in his wrists against her face. She felt the desperate, terrifying love growing between them, a flower blooming in a graveyard. She wanted to pull him through the bars. She wanted to push him away to save him. "You have to be careful," she choked out. "Ephraim, he wants blood. He will hurt you to get to me." Jonah withdrew one hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his touch infinitely tender. "Let him try," Jonah said. Then his face changed. The tenderness hardened into something bleak and old. He looked down at their joined hands. "I have a debt," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "When I rode with the regulators, we burned a homestead in Lincoln County. There was a family inside. We were told it was empty. It wasn't." Eliza went still, listening to the confession he was tearing out of himself. "I didn't light the match," Jonah said, "but I stood guard while it burned. I heard them screaming. I did nothing." He looked up at her, his eyes haunted by a ghost she had never seen. "I have carried that silence for 10 years. I thought maybe I was damned, that there was no way to balance the ledger. He gripped her hand again, fiercely. But I will not stand guard this time. I will not watch an innocent person burn to satisfy a lie. If there is any justice left in this God-forsaken world, it starts here. With you. Jonah, Eliza whispered, her heart aching for his pain as much as her own. You are a good man. I am a man trying to be good, he corrected. There is a difference. The heavy door to the office banged open. Time's up! Cole! Lawson yelled from the front room. Jonah stood up slowly. He squeezed her hands one last time, then released them. The loss of contact made Eliza shiver. I will be watching, Jonah said. I will be right outside. Try to sleep. He turned and walked out, taking the light with him, leaving Eliza alone in the dark with the wind screaming outside like a chorus of the damned. The storm hit with the force of a hammer. By midnight, Ash Hollow was buried. Snow drifted 4 feet deep against the windward side of the buildings. The roads were gone. The telegraph lines were down. The town was a sealed box, trapping everyone inside with their fear and their prejudices. The saloon was the only place with enough heat and light to keep the darkness at bay. It was packed with men, ranchers stranded in town, railroad workers, and the usual drifters. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of wet wool and whiskey. Ephraim Kane held court at a table near the stove. He was drunk, his face flushed and sweaty, his voice slurring but loud. She is a witch, Ephraim spat, slamming his glass down. That is what she is. Bewitched my brother. Made him crazy. Women like that. They got a power. They use their bodies to twist a man's mind until he doesn't know up from down. A few men nodded, murmuring agreement. It was an easy story to believe. It absolved them of their own sins to blame a woman's influence. And that cowboy, Ephraim continued, his eyes narrowing. Cole. He is bewitched too, protecting a murderess. I bet she warms his bed. I bet she pays him in trade. Jonah stood at the far end of the bar. He had not touched his whiskey. He stood with his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the room, watching the faces. He heard the words. He felt the hate rising in the room like floodwater. He wanted to walk over there and smash Ephraim's teeth down his throat. His hand twitched toward his gun, but he held himself back. Violence now would only prove them right. It would give Lawson a reason to lock him up too. And then Eliza would be defenseless. He watched the scapegoating happen in real time. He saw how easy it was for fear to turn into hate. They were scared of the storm, scared of the drought, scared of their own failings. Eliza was just the vessel they were pouring that fear into. He finished his drink in one swallow, the burn of the whiskey doing nothing to thaw the ice in his gut. He tipped his hat to the bartender and walked out into the blizzard. He had work to do. While the men drank and postured, a quieter resistance was forming. In the kitchen of the boarding house, Mrs. Keats sat with Mrs. Crawford. The shopkeeper had braved the drifts to come over, bringing a bottle of medicinal brandy. I do not believe it, Mrs. Crawford said, her voice low. I watched that girl sew. I watched her handle fabric. A woman with murder in her heart does not have hands that gentle. Mrs. Keats nodded, staring into the fire. She mended my best quilt. She fixed the tear so you couldn't even see it. She worked for every meal I gave her, never complained, never asked for charity. Ephraim Kane is a snake, Mrs. Crawford said. Always has been. He owes money all over town. But the Reverend, Mrs. Keats hesitated. To go against the preacher was a terrifying thought. The Reverend is a man, Mrs. Crawford said, pouring a small measure of brandy into a teacup. And men can be fools, Lorna, even men of God. It was a small spark, barely a flicker in the dark. But it was there. Solidarity, born of shared labor and silent observation. The next day, the storm raged on. Reverend Halpern made his way to the jailhouse, shaking the snow from his black coat like a great crow. He stood outside the cell, his Bible clutched in his hand. Confess, Eliza, he intoned. Confess your sin and save your soul. The body can be destroyed, but the spirit must be cleansed. Eliza sat on the bench. shivering. She had not slept. "I have nothing to confess. Reverend," she said, her voice raspy. "I did not kill him." "Pride," Halpern sighed. "The deadliest sin. You feel cursed, do you not? You told Mrs. Keats you felt a darkness on you. What is that darkness? Eliza, if not guilt." He twisted her own words, her own trauma, and weaponized them against her. "The Lord knows," Halpern said. "You cannot hide from him. You hated your husband. You wished him dead. And when the fire came, you rejoiced." "No," Eliza whimpered, covering her ears. "No, I didn't." But the doubt wormed its way in. "Did I?" she thought. "Did I hesitate? Did I want him to die?" The exhaustion and the cold were making her mind fracture. Halpern's voice was a hammer, chipping away at her sanity. Jonah did not stay in the saloon. He went to the livery stable, where he had slept in the tack room. But it wasn't enough. He needed his own ground. He mounted his horse, fighting the animal's reluctance, and rode out into the teeth of the storm. It was a foolish, reckless ride, the wind nearly blinding him, but he made it to his cabin in the hills. Inside, the air was freezing. He did not light a fire. He went to the loose floorboard under his bunk and pried it up. Beneath it was a box wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled it out. Inside lay a heavy Colt Peacemaker, the metal dull and gray, the grip worn smooth by years of use. It was his old gun, the gun he had used in the range wars, the gun he had sworn to put down. He sat at the table in the cold dark. He stripped the weapon, cleaning every spring, every screw. His hands moved with a familiar, deadly grace. He oiled the cylinder. He checked the action. Click, click, click. He loaded it. 6 rounds, lead and powder. His face was a mask of tragedy. He did not want this. He had tried to build a life of fences and cattle, a life of peace, but the world would not let him. If Lawson tried to take her, if Ephraim tried to hurt her, Jonah knew what he would do. He would become the monster they thought he was, so that she could live. He holstered the gun, threw his heavy coat back on, and rode back into the whiteout, heading for town. In the gray, frozen hours before dawn, the wind finally died. The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza pulled herself up to the bars of her cell. She was weak with hunger and cold. She rested her forehead against the iron. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. It was not to God, who seemed very far away, but to the only presence that felt real. "Jonah," she whispered into the silence. "Please, do not come back. Go, right away." She knew what he was planning. She had seen it in his eyes. He was going to fight for her, and she knew, with a terrible certainty, that if he fought the town, he would die. "Don't die for me," she begged the empty air. "Please, just let me go. Save yourself." But even as she prayed, she knew he wouldn't, and the thought of his stubborn, enduring love was the only thing that kept her from screaming as the sun began to rise over the snow-buried town. The town hall of Ash Hollow was a drafty, barn-like structure that usually smelled of sawdust and stale tobacco. But on this morning, it smelled of wet wool and fear. The blizzard had passed, leaving the town buried under 3 feet of heavy, blinding white snow. But the storm inside the hall was just beginning, because the roads were impassable. Marshal Lawson could not transport his prisoner to the county seat. The mountain passes would be closed for a week, perhaps 2. And so, in a compromise born of necessity and the volatile temper of the town, a preliminary hearing was convened. It was not a trial. Lawson had insisted, merely an inquiry to determine if Eliza Moran should be held in the cell or released under house arrest until the thaw. But everyone in the room knew it was a trial. It was a trial of character, played out before a jury of neighbors who had already sharpened their knives. The room was packed. Ranchers who had been stranded in town by the weather stood shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers and railroad men. Wives, clutching shawls tight around their chests, sat on the front benches, their eyes wide and hungry. The air was thick, heated by a pot-belly stove that groaned in the corner and by the sheer press of bodies. Eliza sat at a small table near the front. The shackles were gone. but her wrists were raw and red. She wore the same torn dress she had arrived in, though Mrs. Keats had lent her a clean gray shawl. She looked small against the vast, rough backdrop of the room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Marshal Lawson stood behind a raised podium, looking uncomfortable. He was a man who preferred the clarity of a warrant to the messy ambiguity of a public hearing. To the side, standing like a dark pillar against the wall, was Reverend Halpern. He held his Bible against his chest like a shield, his eyes fixed on Eliza with the cold detachment of a judge who has already written the sentence. And near the door, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, was Jonah Cole. He had not taken a seat. He watched the room with the predatory stillness of a wolf guarding its den. His face was impassive, but his eyes tracked every movement, every whisper, every shift in the mood of the crowd. "We will come to order," Marshal Lawson boomed, banging a gavel that looked suspiciously like a carpenter's mallet. "This is not a court of law. This is a hearing to determine the status of the prisoner, Mrs. Eliza Moran, regarding the warrant from Carbon County." He cleared his throat. "Mr. Ephraim Kane, step forward." Ephraim strode to the front of the room. He had shaved, and his hair was slicked back with oil, but nothing could mask the bitterness etched into the lines around his mouth. He looked at Eliza with a hatred so pure it was almost breathless. "Tell us what you know of the events of November 4th, Lawson said. Ephraim turned to the crowd, pitching his voice to reach the back rows. "I know that my brother, Thomas Kane, was a good man, a hard-working man. He took this woman in when she had nothing. He gave her a home. He put clothes on her back." He paused for effect, shaking his head. "But it was not enough for her. She was always restless, always looking out the window. I saw the way she looked at other men when we went into town. She tempted him. She twisted his mind until he was drinking to drown out her nagging and her coldness." "Objection," Jonah said from the back. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a knife. "He is testifying to a dead man's thoughts." "Quiet, Cole," Lawson warned, though he looked at Ephraim with a slight frown. "Stick to what you saw. Mr. Kane." "I saw a woman who wanted out," Ephraim spat. "I heard them fighting. I heard her threaten to leave him. And on the night of the fire, everyone knows Thomas was asleep. He was a heavy sleeper. She waited until he was helpless. She knocked over that lamp, or maybe she just threw the oil on him. She burned him alive to be free of her vows, and to get her hands on the insurance money." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Insurance money? The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Greed was a motive everyone understood. It turned a tragedy into a calculation. "She is a spider," Ephraim said, pointing a shaking finger at Eliza. "She is a black widow who kills her mate and walks away without a scorch mark on her pretty skin." Eliza flinched as if he had struck her. The crowd rumbled, a low sound of agreement. The women in the front row whispered behind their hands, their eyes hard. "Mrs. Moran," Lawson said, looking at her. "Your turn. Stand up." Eliza tried to stand, but her legs felt like water. She gripped the edge of the table, forcing herself up. She felt the weight of 100 stairs pressing on her skin. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to sink into the floorboards and vanish. But then she looked at Jonah. He was watching her. He did not nod. He did not smile. He simply looked at her with that unwavering, steady belief he had offered her in the cell. "I am here," his eyes said. "Stand." Eliza took a breath. It rattled in her chest. "I did not kill my husband," she said. Her voice was a whisper. "Speak up," a man shouted from the back. Eliza raised her chin. A spark of anger, hot and sudden, ignited in her belly. She was tired of being afraid. She was tired of the lies. "I did not kill him," she said, her voice shaking but louder. "But Ephraim is right about one thing. Thomas was a hard worker, but he was not a good man." The room went quiet. "He drank," Eliza said, "and when he drank, he became a devil. For 3 years. I hid the bruises. I told people I fell down the stairs. I told people I was clumsy. But Thomas liked to use his fists." She looked directly at Mrs. Crawford, in the second row. He broke my arm 2 winters ago. Do you remember? Mrs. Crawford, I came into your store and I could not lift the sack of flour. You asked me what happened. Mrs. Crawford stiffened, her face pale. On the night of the fire, Eliza continued, the words spilling out now, a torrent she could no longer hold back. He came home in a rage. He had lost money at cards. He blamed me. He said I was looking at him with judgment. He picked up the lantern. He swung it at me. Eliza closed her eyes, seeing the memory as vividly as if it were happening in the room. I pushed him, she said. I pushed him to get away. He stumbled. He was so drunk. He fell against the wall. The lantern shattered. The oil went everywhere. The curtains caught first. And you left him, Ephraim shouted. I tried to pull him, Eliza cried, opening her eyes. Tears were streaming down her face, but she did not wipe them away. He was passed out. He was a big man, and he was dead weight. The smoke was so thick, it filled my throat like wool. I dragged him to the doorway. But the heat, God, the heat! She looked at the marshal. I blacked out in the yard. When I woke up, the roof had collapsed. I did not light that fire. I tried to save the man who beat me. She paused, her chest heaving. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of her neighbors. And yes, she whispered, the truth raw and terrible. Sometimes, when he hit me, sometimes I wished he would die. I prayed for it, but I never raised my hand to kill him. I just wanted the pain to stop. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. Faces in the crowd had changed. A few of the ranch wives lowered their eyes, staring at their laps. They recognized the story. They knew the pattern of long sleeves in summer and excuses made for clumsy falls. Some of the men looked away, shifting uncomfortably, unwilling to see the reflection of their own tempers in the portrait of the dead husband. Reverend Halpern stepped forward, sensing the shift in sympathy. He moved like a crow landing on a fence post. Mrs. Moran, Halpern said, his voice smooth and cold. You speak of violence, but tell me, did you fulfill your duties as a wife? Scripture tells us that a wife must submit to her husband. Perhaps if you had been more obedient, more yielding, tragedy could have been avoided. The words hung in the air, a poisonous cloud. He was suggesting that the abuse was her fault, that if she had just been smaller, quieter, meeker, she wouldn't have been hit. Eliza felt the shame flare up, the old conditioning that said everything was her fault. She opened her mouth to apologize, to agree. That is enough, a voice said. Mrs. Crawford stood up. She was a pillar of the community, a woman who terrified half the town with her sharp tongue. She smoothed her apron, her hands shaking slightly. I saw the bruises. Mrs. Crawford said clearly. 2 years ago, Eliza came in. Her sleeve slipped up. Her arm was black and blue from wrist to elbow. That was not a fall. That was a grip. A man's grip. She looked at Halpern. I did not ask her then. I should have, but do not stand there, Reverend, and tell us that a woman earns a broken arm by not scrubbing the floor hard enough. And she works, another voice chimed in. It was Mrs. Keats. The boarding house owner stood up, looking terrified but resolute. Since she came to my house, Eliza Moran has worked harder than any 3 men in this room. She mends, she scrubs, she sews. She has never asked for a penny she did not earn. She is honest. A murderer does not sew lace on a christening gown with hands that shake from guilt. The mood in the room fractured. The monolithic wall of judgment was cracking. Character witnesses are all well and good, Marshal Lawson said, though he looked less certain now. But we have a sworn statement here from Mr. Kane. And who speaks for the accuser? Jonah asked. He pushed off the wall and walked to the front of the room. The crowd parted for him instinctively. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his spurs jingling softly in the silence. He stopped in front of the marshal's podium. You all know me, Jonah said. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the marshal. You know I keep to myself. You know I have a past. He turned slowly to face the room. 10 years ago, I rode with the regulator faction down in Lincoln County. I took coin to ride with men who settled disputes with bullets. I have seen things that would turn your stomachs. A murmur of shock went through the room. They had suspected, but to hear it confessed openly was different. I have seen men who kill for pleasure. Jonah said, I have seen men who kill for money. I know the look in a person's eye when they have taken a life and they liked it. He turned and looked at Eliza. His face softened, the scars appearing less jagged in the dim light. I found this woman on the edge of a cliff, Jonah said quietly. She was ready to jump because she thought she was poison. I have watched her for weeks. I have watched her work. I have watched her tremble when a door slams. He looked back at the crowd, his eyes hard as flint. That is not the look of a killer. That is the look of prey. I know the difference, and so do you, if you are honest with yourselves. Marshal Lawson rubbed his face with a beefy hand. He looked at the paperwork on his desk, then at Ephraim, then at Eliza. The certainty of the warrant was dissolving under the weight of the testimony. Mr. Kane, Lawson said, turning to Ephraim, you said you heard them fighting. Did you actually see the fire start? Well, no, Ephraim stammered. I was in the barn, but I know she did it. And this insurance policy, Lawson said, his eyes narrowing. Who is the beneficiary? It was Thomas's wife, Ephraim said quickly. But if she is convicted of a felony, if she is proven to be the cause of death, then the claim is voided, or it goes to the next of kin. Which is you, Lawson said. It was not a question. It is my family's money, Ephraim shouted, his face turning a mottled red. My father built that farm. She has no right to it. She ruined him. So you need her to hang, Jonah said, his voice deadly calm. You need her to hang so you can cash a check. You shut your mouth, gunslinger! Ephraim screamed. He was losing control, the carefully constructed mask of the grieving brother slipping to reveal the greedy, desperate man beneath. Women like her, Ephraim yelled, spraying spittle. They come in, they spread their legs, and they take everything. She deserves to burn. She deserves whatever she gets. He lunged. It was a sudden, violent movement. Ephraim reached across the divide, his hands clawed, aiming for Eliza's throat. Eliza screamed and scrambled back, her chair tipping over with a crash. Jonah moved. He did not draw his gun. He stepped in, a blur of motion, and caught Ephraim by the lapels of his greasy coat. He slammed the smaller man backward. Ephraim flew 5 feet and crashed into the front bench, sending people scrambling. Ephraim scrambled up, his hand going to the revolver at his belt. Don't! Lawson roared, drawing his own weapon. Every man in the room who was armed, which was most of them, put a hand near their holster. The air crackled with sudden, lethal tension. Jonah stood between Eliza and Ephraim. He stood with his legs apart, his hands hanging loose at his sides, inches from the Colt peacemaker. He did not look at the marshal. He looked at Ephraim. Touch it, Jonah said softly. Go ahead, put your hand on that gun. Ephraim froze. He looked into Jonah's eyes and saw his own death waiting there. He saw a man who had walked through hell and was perfectly willing to send someone else there. If anyone tries to lay a hand on her again, Jonah said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall, they go through me. I am done watching bullies run this town. I am done watching you people tear a woman apart because it makes you feel righteous. He looked at the marshal. Lawson, this ends now. Marshal Lawson looked at Ephraim, who was panting and wild-eyed. He looked at the crowd, which was now frightened and confused. He looked at Eliza, huddled by the overturned chair. Holster your weapons, Lawson barked. All of you. Ephraim slowly took his hand away from his belt. This hearing is over, Lawson declared. He slammed the gavel down. There is too much doubt here, conflicting motives, lack of witnesses. I am not sending a woman to the gallows on the word of a man who stands to profit from her death. You cannot do this, Ephraim shouted. I have a warrant. The warrant is held, Lawson said firmly. I am keeping Mrs. Moran in custody, but not in a cell. She is under town arrest until the circuit judge comes through in the spring. I will let him sort out the insurance and the fire. Until then, she stays here." "This is a travesty," Ephraim yelled. He looked around for support, but the crowd had turned. They had seen his greed. They had seen his violence. "Get out of here, Ephraim," Lawson said. "Before I lock you up for disturbing the peace," Ephraim sneered. He looked at Eliza, then at Jonah. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You watch your back. Cowboy, accidents happen." He stormed out of the hall, the heavy doors banging shut behind him. Reverend Halpern looked at the marshal, his lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. He said nothing, simply turning and sweeping out of the room, his moral authority dented but unbroken. The townspeople began to disperse. They moved quietly, murmuring to one another. They were shaken. They had come for a spectacle, for a confirmation of their prejudices. But they had been forced to look at something much uglier, their own complicity. Mrs. Crawford walked up to Eliza. She reached out and touched Eliza's shoulder. It was a brief, awkward touch, but it was an apology. Then she walked away. Jonah turned to Eliza. He reached down and righted her chair. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," Eliza whispered. She was trembling uncontrollably, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard. "Jonah, you—" "I told you," he said. "I am not leaving." Marshal Lawson walked over. He holstered his gun and sighed, looking 10 years older. "You can take her," Lawson said to Jonah. "But she stays in town. She reports to me every Monday." "And Cole?" "Yeah. Keep an eye on Kane," Lawson said quietly. "He is not the kind of man who walks away from a fight. He is the kind who comes back in the dark." "I know," Jonah said. Night had fallen by the time they left the town hall. The sky had cleared, revealing a canopy of stars that looked sharp enough to draw blood. The air was still and bitterly cold. Eliza stepped out onto the boardwalk. She took a deep breath, the frozen air stinging her lungs. She was not free, not entirely, but the chains were gone. The threat of immediate transport to a hanging judge was gone. She looked at the street. The windows of the houses were glowing with yellow light. Behind those curtains, people were talking about her. They were arguing about guilt and innocence, but she didn't care. She turned to Jonah. He was standing beside her, looking out at the snow-covered street. "You saved me," she said. Jonah shook his head. "I just told the truth. You risked everything," she insisted. "You told them who you were. You let them judge you to save me." Jonah looked at her. "I don't care what they think. I only care what you think." A gust of wind swept down the street, kicking up a plume of snow. Eliza shivered, wrapping her thin shawl tighter. Jonah stepped closer. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat. He did not take it off this time. Instead, he opened it like a wing. "Come here," he said. Eliza stepped into him. He wrapped the coat around her, enclosing her within the warmth of the wool and his own body. She pressed her face against his chest, hearing the steady, reassuring thump of his heart. She circled her arms around his waist, clinging to him. They stood there in the middle of the street, under the watchful eyes of the town. It was a flagrant display. It was a scandal, and neither of them gave a damn. Eliza felt the solidness of him, the immovable strength that had stood between her and the mob. For the first time since the fire, she did not feel like a leaf blowing in the wind. She felt anchored. "Let's go home," Jonah murmured into her hair. "Mrs. Keats is waiting." "Take me with you," she whispered, the reckless thought surfacing before she could stop it. "Not to the boarding house. Take me to the cabin." Jonah stiffened slightly. "Eliza." "I don't want to be alone," she said, pulling back just enough to look up at him. "Please, just for tonight. I need to be where it's quiet. I need to be where you are." Jonah looked down at her. He saw the exhaustion, the fear that still lingered in the corners of her eyes, but he also saw trust, absolute, terrified trust. "The road is blocked," he said softly, "but the horse can make it if we take it slow." "Take me," she said. He nodded once. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. keeping her inside the shelter of his coat, and walked her toward the livery stable. They walked through the snow, leaving 2 sets of footprints that merged into one path, walking away from the town and into the dark, quiet safety of the night. Ephraim Kane left Ash Hollow 3 days after the hearing. He did not leave quietly, nor did he leave by choice. Marshal Lawson rode beside him, a shotgun resting across his saddle, escorting the man all the way to the county line. Ephraim rode with his back stiff and his head high, but his eyes were burning coals of hatred that promised a return in the dark. He disappeared over the rise, a black smudge against the blinding white of the snow, taking his threats with him into the high country. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the air remained thin and tense. The sensationalism of the hearing faded, replaced by the mundane struggle of surviving the tail end of a Wyoming winter. The rumors about Eliza did not vanish. They simply went underground, whispering through the cracks in the floorboards and behind the church doors. People still watched her when she walked to the mercantile. They still looked for the scarlet letter they were sure she hid beneath her gray wool shawl. But fewer of them spoke the words aloud, shamed into silence by the memory of Jonah Cole standing in the town hall, ready to kill or die for her. February bled into March, and the iron grip of the frost began to loosen. The drifts turned to slush, and the roads became rivers of mud. The world was waking up, but Eliza found that the thaw did not reach the frozen places inside her. The nightmares came more frequently now that the immediate threat of hanging was gone. In the safety of her small room under the eaves, she would wake in the gray hours before dawn, gasping for air, her lungs burning with the phantom sensation of smoke. She would sit up, sweat cooling on her skin, convinced that the walls were closing in. The Thomas was standing in the corner with the lantern raised high. The guilt was a heavy, dull stone in her gut. She had not killed him, but she had survived him. And sometimes, in the dark, that felt like the same sin. Jonah saw the shadows under her eyes. He saw the way her hands trembled when she poured coffee. He did not try to fix her with words. He did not smother her with questions. He simply stayed near. He split his time between the ranch work that paid his wages and a project he kept secret. He would disappear for days at a time, riding out to the north with a pack mule loaded with tools and supplies. When he returned, he smelled of fresh-cut timber and sweat. He would sit on the porch with her in the evenings, whittling a piece of pine, his presence a silent anchor against the drift of her anxiety. One afternoon in early April, when the wind had softened enough to carry the scent of wet earth and new grass, Jonah brought 2 horses to the front of the boarding house. "Put on your boots," he told her. "I want to show you something." Eliza looked at the horses, then at him. "Is it far?" "Far enough to be quiet," Jonah said. "Close enough to be home." They rode north, away from the town and the road that led to the desert. They climbed through the foothills, picking their way through stands of aspen where the buds were just beginning to show green. The air was crisp and clean. After an hour, they crested a ridge. The land fell away before them into a sheltered valley. It was a bowl of earth cupped by the hills, protected from the worst of the wind. A narrow creek wound through the center, the water running high and clear with snowmelt. Cottonwoods and willows clung to the banks, their branches hazy with new growth. But it was not the land that drew Eliza's eye. It was the structure standing on a small rise overlooking the water. It was the skeleton of a cabin. Rough-hewn posts stood tall and straight, supporting the framework of a roof that was half-shingled. The walls were only partially raised, leaving the interior open to the sky and the valley. Piles of lumber and stone sat nearby, evidence of weeks of solitary, back-breaking labor. Jonah reined in his horse. He looked at the structure, then at Eliza. "I claimed this land 5 years ago," he said. "I always meant to build on it. I just never found a reason to finish it." Eliza stared at the rough outline of the home. It was isolated. It was wild. The rocks were sharp, and the scrub brush was thick. It was not an easy place, but the sky above it was vast, a limitless expanse of blue that felt like a promise. "It is beautiful," she whispered. It is rough. Jonah corrected her. It needs a lot of work. The roof is not done. The floor is still dirt. The wind will still find a way in. He turned in his saddle to face her. His expression was serious, stripped of any artifice. I cannot promise you safety from every storm. Eliza, he said, I cannot promise that people will stop talking. I cannot promise that the memories will stop waking you up in the night. He took a breath, his hand tightening on the pommel of his saddle. I am a flawed man. I am stubborn, and I have a temper, and I carry my own ghosts. I do not know how to be gentle all the time, but I know that I do not want to wake up another morning without you. Eliza felt her heart hammer against her ribs. The fear of attachment, of tying herself to another man who might break her, flared up hot and bright. But beneath it was a yearning so deep it ached, a hunger for a place to rest, for a door she could lock, for a hand that would not hurt her. You want me to stay? She asked, her voice trembling. I want you to be with me, Jonah said. Here, we can finish it together, or we can leave it and ride on, but I am asking you to choose. Eliza looked at the half-built cabin. She saw the work in it. She saw the hours he had spent lifting beams and hauling stone, all while she was sewing in town. He had been building a sanctuary for her while she was still waiting for the gallows. She nudged her horse closer to his. She reached out and placed her hand over his, where it rested on his leg. I am tired of running, she said. Jonah turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with hers. Then stop. They dismounted and walked up the rise to the cabin. The wind whistled through the gaps in the boards, but inside the perimeter of the posts, the air felt still. Jonah tied the horses and turned to her. He took off his hat and tossed it onto a stack of lumber. The sun caught the silver in the scar on his jaw. Eliza stepped close to him. She reached up, her fingers trembling as she traced the line of that scar. It was raised and hard, a map of old violence. She moved her hand down his neck, feeling the heavy pulse of his life, and rested her palm over his heart. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it tighter against his chest. His eyes searched hers, looking for doubt, looking for fear. Eliza, he breathed. The intensity that had been simmering between them for months. Through the cold nights in the cabin, the terror of the jail cell, the rage of the hearing, finally boiled over. Eliza rose on her toes and pressed her mouth to his. It was not a tentative kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of dust and coffee and longing. Jonah made a low sound in his throat and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her body flush against his. He held her as if he were drowning and she was the only solid thing in the ocean. They moved together into the shelter of the unfinished walls. The ground was bare earth, hard and cold. But Jonah pulled the heavy blankets from the saddlebags and spread them out in the corner where the roof was finished. He lowered her down, his movements urgent but careful. He hovered over her, his hands framing her face, his gaze devouring her. Are you sure? He asked, his voice rasping. Yes, Eliza whispered. Yes. But as his hands moved over her, as the weight of him settled against her, a flash of memory struck her. The smell of wool, the heaviness of a body, the feeling of being trapped. She gasped, her body going rigid. She turned her face away, a small, sharp cry escaping her throat. Jonah stopped instantly. He did not freeze in frustration. He froze in concern. He lifted his weight off her immediately, pulling back until he was sitting on his heels. He did not touch her. He gave her the space she needed to breathe. Eliza, he said softly, look at me. Eliza lay there, shaking, her eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the anger, waiting for the demand. I'm sorry, she stammered. I'm sorry. Do not apologize, Jonah said firmly. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away the tear that had leaked from her eye. He waited until she opened her eyes and looked at him. Nothing happens that you do not choose, he said. Do you hear me? Your no is law. If you want me to stop, I stop. If you want to leave, we leave. You are safe here. Eliza looked at him. She saw the restraint in his muscles, the desire still burning in his eyes. but she saw the respect that burned brighter. He was not Thomas. He was not a man who took. He was a man who gave. The knot of shame in her belly, the tight, cold coil that had been there for years, began to loosen. "I do not want to leave," she whispered. I want to try." "Slow," Jonah promised. "We go slow." And they did. He kissed her again, gently this time, letting her set the pace. He let her learn the weight of his hands, not as weapons, but as tools of worship. He let her find her own desire in the wreckage of her past. When they finally came together, it was not perfect. It was clumsy and fierce and raw. But it was theirs. It was an act of reclamation. With the wind sighing through the unfinished walls and the smell of pine and earth surrounding them, Eliza Moran took back her own body. Later, as the sun dipped below the rim of the valley, casting long blue shadows across the floor, they lay wrapped in the rough wool blanket. Jonah lay on his back, one arm pillowed under his head, the other holding Eliza against his side. She rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the creek bubbling in the distance. It was a peaceful sound. "The roof needs tar paper," Jonah said lazily, staring up at the beams. "Before the spring rains come." Eliza laughed. It was a rusty sound, unused for too long, but it felt good in her throat. "You bring a woman to a romantic ruin and you talk about tar paper?" "I am a practical man," Jonah said, squeezing her shoulder. "Romance does not keep the rain off your head." Eliza closed her eyes. The world outside this valley was still dangerous. Ephraim was out there somewhere. The townspeople still whispered. Justice was a messy, partial thing. But here, in this half-built home, her heart felt lighter than it had in 10 years. "We will need curtains," she said. "For the windows." "If you sew them," Jonah said. "I will sew them," she promised. They did not move into the cabin immediately. It took another month of work before the walls were sealed and the stove was installed. In that time, rumors reached them from Ash Hollow. Mrs. Keats told Eliza while they were folding sheets that Reverend Halpern was using her story in his Sunday sermons. He spoke of the tempter in the wilderness and the weakness of the flesh. He did not use her name, but everyone knew who the cautionary tale was intended to be. When Jonah heard, his face went dark. He reached for his gun belt. "I will go have a word with the Reverend," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register. "I will ask him how his scripture explains lying about a neighbor." Eliza put her hand on his arm. "No, Jonah." "He is poisoning the town against you," Jonah argued. "Let him talk." Eliza said. She stood tall, her chin lifted. "If we fight him, we give him power. If we scream, we look guilty. We will live our lives. We will build our home. We will be happy. That is the only thing that will silence him." Jonah looked at her, seeing the steel in her spine. He slowly let go of the belt. "You are a stubborn woman, Eliza Moran." "I have to be," she said. "I am marrying you." They were married in the small office of the Justice of the Peace in the next county over, with only the clerk as a witness. They did not need a church. They had the valley. Over the next year, Eliza slowly carved out a place for herself. She did not try to win over the town with charm. She won them over with competence. When a rancher's wife needed a wedding dress altered in a hurry, she came to Eliza. When the banker's coat tore, he sent it to the cabin in the valley. Eliza worked with a quiet dignity. She looked people in the eye. She held Jonah's hand when they walked into the general store on Saturdays. It was a subtle, constant act of defiance. It forced the town to see them not as a scandal, but as a family. It was late August when the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The air grew still, heavy with a static charge that made the hair on Eliza's arms stand up. She was in the garden she had planted near the creek, gathering the last of the beans. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked west. A wall of darkness was moving across the plains. It stretched from the earth to the heavens, a towering wave of dust and wind that blotted out the sun. "Jonah!" she called out. Jonah was in the corral, working a young horse. He looked up, saw the sky, and immediately let the horse go. He ran toward the cabin. "Get inside," he shouted. "Close the shutters." Eliza ran to the house. The wind hit before she reached the door. A sudden, violent shriek that tore the basket from her hands and sent beans scattering across the yard. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a second. Jonah grabbed her arm and pulled her inside. They slammed the heavy oak door and dropped the bar. Outside, the world disappeared. The light vanished, replaced by a roaring, gritty twilight. The wind hammered against the logs, sounding like 1,000 fists beating on the wood. Dust hissed through every tiny crack, filling the air with a fine, choking powder. Eliza backed away from the door. The noise was deafening. It sounded like the fire. It sounded like the roar of the flames that night. Panic, sharp and irrational, seized her. The old fear surged up, the certainty that she was not allowed to be happy, that the world would always come to take everything away from her. The cabin felt fragile. The walls felt like paper. "It is going to take it all," she whispered. "It is going to blow it all down." She began to tremble, her hands flying to her mouth. She saw the roof tearing off. She saw Jonah being swept away into the dark. "Eliza." Jonah was there. He did not shout over the wind. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. He locked his hands together over her stomach, anchoring her. "Breathe," he said into her ear. "Please don't let me go," she cried out, her voice breaking. "If it falls apart, if the walls come down, don't let me walk into the dark this time. Don't let me go." Jonah held her tighter. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He felt her shaking, and he absorbed it into his own solid frame. "I am not letting go," he promised. His voice was low and steady, vibrating through her ribs. "I cannot stop the storm. Eliza, I cannot stop the wind, but I can stand here. I can hold you while it blows. I am scared," she wept. "I know," Jonah said, "but look where you are. You are not in the desert. You are not in a cell. You are home." He turned her in his arms so that she faced him. The cabin was dark, lit only by the gray gloom filtering through the cracks. But she could see his eyes. They were calm. They were the eyes of a man who had faced death and chosen life. "We are here," he said. "We are together, and we will be here when the dust settles." Eliza looked at him. She listened to the wind screaming outside, trying to tear their life down, and then she felt his arms, hard and immovable around her. She took a breath. The dust tasted of earth, but it also tasted of survival. She buried her face in his shirt, clutching the fabric with both hands. "Just hold me," she whispered. "Always," Jonah said. The storm roared around their small home for hours, scouring the wood and stripping the leaves from the trees. But inside, in the center of the dark, two broken souls stood locked together. They did not pray for salvation. They did not ask for a miracle. They simply held on to each other, a stubborn, enduring presence in a world that tried to grind them down, finding peace not in the absence of the storm, but in the shelter of their own embrace. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Eliza and Jonah resonated with you. It is a story about the hard work of healing and the courage it takes to trust again after the world has let you down. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening from. What did you think of the ending? Do you think they found the peace they were looking for? If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the American frontier. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Until next time, keep your fences mended and your powder dry.